to Safe Space, where life questions are talked about from Christian perspectives. Welcome to this segment where I talk to Dr. Sharon on being a Christian feminist in Asia. Welcome back, Sharon.
Thank you, Alwyn.
Okay. So, how is your feminism affected or influenced by the fact that you're an Asian as well? Is there a difference between Asian feminism, Western feminism, and what are the differences?
Yes, it has everything to do with the context in which we inhabit. So an African feminist, feminists in the context of Europe or America would be very different. And in so much of my work and also presentations and radio programs like this, that anchors my feminism in mixed real, tests and puts into practice my feminist ideology in an Asian context. So what is the difference? Ideologically, and I think we covered this in part in the first segment, your opening question, where you asked me about feminisms, and I mentioned that feminist post-colonial feminism basically came about much later, and that was basically started or conceptualized and put into practice or articulated by women of color, and that included women from Asia, who found that a white middle-class woman's understanding of marginalization, for instance, or issues like poverty or globalization or ethnic conflict. You couldn't talk about these issues in a vacuum, in a very universal sense. So although universal suffrage had its time and place as a rallying call, but in order to understand, oppression or poverty and other forms of oppressions or marginalizations, such as ethnic or religious, if you were marginalized by virtue of not just your sex, but also your ethnicity and your religious affiliation, which we are in this blessed country of ours, then that was what women of color were arguing towards, that sisterhood, on the contrary, is not global, simply because there are differentiated experiences of oppression and marginalization. And of course, Asia is further broken down because it's quite monolithic. Singapore is very different from Malaysia, it's very different from China, for instance, and Cambodia or Brunei. And so the practice of feminisms in these various countries are also impacted by what we consider Asian values, which was first promulgated by the man who's running again for elections, which is Mahathir. This whole, privileging of the community over individual welfare, and how in his day, 22 years as our premier, Mahathir talked about, human rights as a whole Western construct, things like that. So Western feminisms and Asian feminisms are fundamentally different because of the context. And the feminist argument is always that, we don't speak in abstractions or in terms of meta-narratives or in universals, but in, knowledge that is grounded in lived realities of men, of women, children.
Thanks. So in Malaysia's context, what would be the top 3 or 4 issues and problems that feminists tend to highlight?
For sure, because the majority of Malaysians are Muslim. Although we are not yet an Islamic state, but we are Muslim dominant. So the question of religion and race that are so heavily politicized, and as we're gearing up for the coming elections, we feel that all the more keenly. So feminisms in Malaysia, the intersecting rubrics would be gender and or sexuality, but intersecting with race and religion, certainly in the context of Malaysia.
Okay, so if I understand you right, you're saying that Western feminists tend to take a more universal meta-narratival approach, whereas Asian feminists focus on the specific issues in their region and their community. Is that right?
No. That was the prior knowledge. where, you know, knowledge was whether you were talking about law or politics or science or religion, for a long time, and in many areas of study still continue to be dominated by men. So feminist knowledge or feminist standpoint epistemologies and feminisms are an extension of that, are a response. So where, you know, knowledge pursued and constructed by men tended to dwell on the universe or meta-narratives, you know, having universal laws, so men of science and men of theology, for instance, always spoke in very universal terms, you know, a one-shoe-fit-all sort of scenario. The first feminists' counter-discourse was to argue against that, you know, knowledge had to come up from, you know, the bowels, if you like, of women's lived experiences. And of course there was a partiality towards women's narratives. Why? Because women's narratives were either hidden or were lost or were trivialized, okay? And it's really difficult to actually reclaim lost voices. So what is different from Asian feminisms or African voices in terms of first wave feminisms was the fact that for white, you know, first wave of feminists, when they spoke about women's oppression, they spoke on behalf of women of color, all women. So the whole woman question, you know, was seen as a very monolithic one, that all women were the same.
Sure.
But it was necessary to speak in those terms when you are starting out, because, you know, today we need to appreciate, you know, 30, 50, 40 years ago, women needed to mobilize, okay? Women needed to have a particular, you know, standpoint, and that standpoint was rooted in the whole identity of, it was a very essentializing one. It was rooted in the whole gender identity of what it means to be a woman. Sure. What it means to be a woman is to be oppressed, for instance. So if that was the rallying call, you know, white Western feminism spoke on behalf of all women. So it was only a matter of time, inevitably, that women of color would, you know, rise up to speak for themselves. So it's a question of self-representation. Sure. Yes.
Okay, thanks. For the benefit of those who like to read more about Asian feminism, and apart from yourself, can you recommend, who are your other favorite feminist writers from Asia? If you could maybe share some.
Do you mean just Asian feminisms or Asian Christian feminisms?
Perhaps both as well. Asian feminism and Christian feminism.
Okay, in terms of Asian feminisms, there are people like Gayatri Spivak, who started to talk about the subaltern, and it was a whole question of, you know, being spoken for, and however well-intentioned, that is always a problem. So the point is you need to empower those at the margins to speak for themselves. So that's Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. Then there's also people like Afta Bra or Uma Narayan. These are Asian feminists. There's so many good scholars coming from India, for instance. And in terms of Asian feminists, Asian Christian or Asian feminist theologians, there is a group that I belong to. We are a group of Asian women Catholic theologians, or rather Catholic women theologians theologizing in the context of Asia, from South Asia to Southeast to Central Asia to East Asia. And the works of Agnes Brazal, for instance, from the Philippines would be something that I would recommend, wholeheartedly, without reservation. Okay. Besides my own work, as you put it, But there's so many others. I can give you a list.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you could pass that around.
Because maybe at the end, you know, you could have a very short, or you know, reference list of some of the best writers around, especially for those of you who are not familiar with.
I'd be happy to. Yes.
Yeah, sure. So, for a final question, what would be your practical advice to would-be Christian feminists in Malaysia, and would you recommend that more Christians take on the feminist philosophy, or not?
Yeah, thank you, Alwyn, for grounding the final question back into my own life. I think certainly when I started out in my whole journey in feminism back in the 1990s, so I'm like really much older than I look.
We don't.
I was angry. I was an angry feminist,
Right.
so I could really like jive with, you know, the radical feminists. And many people would have this image of like bra burning, like man hating. So I wasn't that, but I remember that anger was what got me started. And in particular, I was so consumed with, you know, growing up. I had a real issue, and it kind of like bugged me that people around me were so well adjusted and were not asking the question that I was asking. And I thought, just going to go mad, you know. And so I was really eaten up by the whole, you know, non-ordination of women question as a Catholic. And often my students even ask me, you know, how is it that I identify as both, you know, Christian and feminist? They seem such a contradiction in terms. And so to me, your last question has everything to do with why I still identify actually as Christian and feminist. And that is because I don't see it, you know, as irreconcilable like water and oil are. That I find that my feminism inflects who I am as a Christian, Catholic specifically, and, you know, how I identify in the ways I identify as a Catholic, as well, you know, colors my feminism. So earlier in the conversation that we had in between the segments, of course, you know, as I tell my students, and I do walk the talk as well, the thing about feminism that you know is kind of like different from most other areas of study. It may be taught in the classroom, you know, in a formal sense, but it is always something that you can't really afford to compartmentalize, because so often I always throw back the question, as you are doing it to me, ask students to relate it back to their own upbringings, their own faith communities, if they identify, you know, if they have a religious affiliation, their own ethnic communities. How does it bring to bear, you know, the feminisms or the concepts that we learn in the classroom? And over the years, it's been almost 3 decades, you know, in terms of teaching, unpacking feminisms for Generation Y and Z and the millennials, you know. It's necessitated a very different packaging, as it were. And I guess the one advice, not that I feel that I'm in a position to advise anybody, because I think the first premise, and therefore the first advice, would be that every individual, and it's not just, you know, for women, it's also for men, because there are men who identify as feminists as well. So it's not a gender territorial thing. That, you know, you have to be the one to decide for yourselves how, you know, your Christian identity and how your feminism, and you may not even want to use the label feminism, because if you believe in, you know, gender equality, if you have a respect for, you know, gender pluralisms and gender diversities, then you would ask yourself constantly, you know, it's very postmodern in the sense that you don't actually arrive, because every day there are challenges. Today there's the Me Too movement. We talked about dubious consent in the first segment. So, you know, as we are challenged every day as Christians, we are also challenged, doubly challenged, I think, if you identify as a feminist or if you are rooting for gender equality. And it is up to each individual to see where, you know, these, like a Venn diagram, you know, can unproblematically overlap, and where there are areas where, you know, you, with all the reflexivity, you are aware, and with all the discernment that, you know, these are areas that I'm less sort of like comfortable with. So for me, on a very, very personal note, I guess the issue that you know, I sort of am a bit more discomforted with would be the whole question of abortion, I guess, of abortion. Intellectually, I understand the feminist argument for a woman's right to bodily determination, you know, the right to terminate a pregnancy. But, you know, as a Christian, and I know that's all the scientific evidence of when life begins, you know, it's put in very clinical terms, right down to the precise day and all that. But that's when the Christian in me, you know, sees it in a more absolute term, and that is, you know, life begins at. So in that sense, the Catholic Church has done its work, at least with me on this one thing. and that, you know, so for me, that would be you know, personally an area where it less overlaps, you know, there's a bit of tension there. But in so many other areas, you know, that is absolutely no problem, and I quite stand apart on the question of ordination, the churches stand on homosexuality, for instance, and, you know, a host of other issues, yeah.
Well, it's interesting you brought up on the topic of abortion, because I think recently, on the question of when life begins, someone told me that she believes that life begins only after 24 weeks, after this phase called fetal viability or something like that. And when I probed further why, her answer was that if she believes that life begins, say, at conception, then given the fact that bodies naturally, you know, moms' bodies naturally, there are some natural abortions. Given that fact, if life does begin at conception, it would make her a murderer. And she felt that was offensive, and because of that, she chose to believe that life begins after, say, 24 weeks. So perhaps one final question is, what is the line, how do we draw a line between feminism and, what's the relationship between feminism and, I don't know, offense and, you know, and feminism and truth and an offense? Is there a relationship there somewhere? Is there a tension there somewhere?
Yes, there's a lot of murky depth.
There's a lot of murky depth.
This is precisely what I was speaking about, Alwyn, that, you know, each individual has to decide for himself or herself where that line is, you see. Yeah, where that line is. And it's not so arbitrary, you know. Sometimes people think it's like a moving target, it's a moving. No, it's not like that, because when there are, you know, moral issues, then and it hits us, you know, in a very raw way. You know, questions like mercy killing, you know, and all this, so many issues. It really comes down to the individual. Deciding.
Because it struck me as ironic, because given your stance about abortion, there would certainly be many feminists who would disagree with you.
Yeah,
who would
of course.
You know, be concerned or challenge you that, oh, you're not a real feminist if you don't. That's one problem we have.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So the point of, you're right. So the point of, you know, a real feminist, I guess for me, because I've been, you know, trying to live this out pretty much every day of my life for like a really long time. These are questions that I continue to ask myself. And depending on what the, you know, challenge is of the day, the answer is different. So all I'm saying is that there are really no absolute terms. There are no absolute terms. And you know, one doesn't just arrive at being a feminist, or a Christian for that matter. We are continually challenged to put into practice, you know, these ideologies or our faith, you know, the whole question of praxis, for instance. And I guess fundamentally, what is my anchor or what is my root? It is to see that it is the more fundamental belief is not feminism in itself. It's not, you know, feminism that's driving my Christianity or Christianity that's driving my feminism. But it's really that, you know, fundamentally for me, I really truly believe that you know, these are not incompatible. Right. So once I start, for me personally, from that premise, then you know, each different challenge or issue, you know, calls this basic premise sometimes to question. It tests it, and so I, you know, use a lot of discernment. I mean, and
thanks. So perhaps we should try not to be too absolute about so many things, and don't judge people so fast. I guess that's one of the.
And certainly, when I walk into, you know, my gender studies classrooms, it's not as if I'm, you know, embroiled with some missionary zeal to have like major conversion of you know, hearts. The battle is half won, because half the time, half of the students are in gender studies classrooms because they want to be, and they are already somehow initiated self. they've gone through some, baptismal rite of initiation. And even if they don't use the word feminist, but, they are there with all of their hang-ups, their angers, and their potentialities and their wisdom as young people. They bring all of that to the classroom. So
it must be very exciting then.
Yeah, it's an amazing journey.
Thanks. Thank you
Join
so much.
us sometime.
I will definitely think about that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for
Welcome.
speaking to me. I hope that our listeners have learned a lot. I definitely learned a lot from you.
Thank you, Alwyn.
Thanks.
Thank you for your questions.
I think this conversation is very important, especially for women or for oppressed, for the oppressed individuals to feel that they have a voice and they should have a voice, and many people have spoken up for them. From a Christian perspective, I totally am with, I fully agree with Sharon on what she said about the compassion, the radical compassion that Jesus had for women, for the outcasts, for lepers, and it is unfortunate from my perspective that many male theologians, probably even including myself, have, if we have covered that part up, in our speeches, in our talks. I think Jesus is way more compassionate to women than much of theology has put him out to be. So that's it for our final and third segment. I'm very glad that Sharon has been able to join us. As some of you know, I worked with Sharon for about 3 years, and she practically saved me from flunking out of my PhD. So I'm really glad that she was around when I needed her. Again, please share your questions to host@safespace.my, because Sharon is a very good writer, and if you ask her, one question, she'll give you like a lot of really good answers. And if she can't answer it, she will just give you some references to make you read more. So thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned, stay space. Thanks.
Got questions? Connect with us. Send us a tweet or an email.